Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show. So the Republican National Convention ended last night with a speech from President Trump. And I have to say I'm rather partisan in this regard, but I thought it was quite a good speech, a good balance of positive and negative. Trump, of course, has an advantage over Joe Biden in that he has been president for 3.5 years, so he can point to accomplishments. Joe Biden was a senator from 1973 until 2009, and then he was vice president for 8 years. He really has nothing in the way of accomplishments. Abraham Lincoln got talked up a lot in the speech. Of course, he was the first Republican president, and Trump went all out in this speech to appeal to black voters. I don't think it's going to do him much good, certainly not amongst female black voters, but he may have some little success with male black voters. But the point of such carrying on is always to appeal to nice, middle of the road, white people. I'm going to go through the speech, some highlights, some things that he said. In a new term as president, we will again build the greatest economy in history, quickly returning to full employment, soaring incomes, and record prosperity. We will defend America against all threats and protect America against all dangers. We will lead America into new frontiers of ambition and discovery, and we will reach for new heights of national achievement. We will rekindle new faith in our values, new pride in our history, and a new spirit of unity that can only be realized through love for our country. Because we understand that America is not a land cloaked in darkness. America is the torch that enlightens the entire world. Now, all politicians' utterances like this, I think the difference is that forma for him. He talked about how the Democrats don't like America. I mean, this is obvious, but he hammered it home. Despite all of our greatness as a nation, everything we've achieved is now endangered. This is the most important election in the history of our country. At no time before have voters faced a clearer choice between two parties, two visions, two philosophies, or two agendas. This election will decide whether we save the American dream or whether we allow a socialist agenda to demolish our cherished destiny. Again, politicians are wont to say that the election that they are fighting is the most important ever, but there's a lot of truth to what Trump says, because America under Trump's second term or under a Joe Biden or who's ever running the show term would be markedly different. The Democrats have made it clear that they really hate America and they mean to transform it. And transform it in such a way that would be markedly and deliberately hostile to the majority of Americans. Trump said at the Democratic National Convention, Joe Biden and his party repeatedly assailed America as a land of racial, economic, and social injustice. So tonight, I ask you a very simple question. How can the Democrat Party lead our country when it spends so much time tearing down our country? In the left's backward view, they do not see America as the most free, just, and exceptional nation on earth. Instead, they see a wicked nation that must be punished for its sins. Our opponents say that redemption for you can only come from giving power to them. This is the tired anthem spoken by every repressive movement throughout history. For 47 years, Joe Biden took the donations of blue-collar workers, gave them hugs and even kisses, and told them he felt their pain. And then he flew back to Washington and voted to ship their jobs to China and many other distant lands. Joe Biden spent his entire career outsourcing the dreams of American workers, offshoring their jobs, opening their borders and sending their sons and daughters to fight in endless foreign wars. And then he talks about how he bullied the other members of NATO, beginning to pony up their fair share. He says, days after taking office, we shocked the Washington establishment and withdrew from the last administration's job-killing Trans-Pacific Partnership. I then approved the Keystone X Dakota Access Pipelines, ended the unfair and cost climate accord, and secured for the first time American energy independence. We passed a record-setting tax and regulation cuts at a rate nobody had ever seen before. Within 3 short years, we built the strongest economy in the history of the world. Washington insiders asked me not to stand up to China. They pleaded with me to let China continue stealing our jobs, ripping us off, and robbing our country blind. But I kept my word to the American people. We took the toughest, boldest, strongest, and hardest hitting action against China in American history. And then he talks about how he replaced NAFTA with an agreement which is, by all accounts, much more favorable to the United States than NAFTA had been. He talks about immigration. In perhaps no area did the Washington special interests try harder to stop us than on my policy of pro-American immigration. But I refuse to back down, and today America's borders are more secure than ever before. We ended catch and release, stopped asylum fraud, took down human traffickers who prey on women and children, and we have deported 50,000 gang members and 500,000 criminal aliens. We have already built 300 miles of border wall, and we are adding 10 new miles every single week. The wall will soon be complete, and it is working beyond our wildest expectations. When I learned that the Tennessee Valley Authority laid off hundreds of American workers and forced them to train their lower-paid foreign replacements, I promptly removed the chairman of the board. And now those talented American workers have been rehired and are back providing power to Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi, North Carolina, and Virginia. They have their old jobs back, and some of them are here with us this evening. Last month, I took on Big Pharma and signed orders that will massively lower the cost of your prescription drugs and to give critically ill patients access to life-saving cures. We passed the decades-long-awaited right to try legislation. We also passed VA accountability and VA choice. He talks about all of the judges that he has appointed. He mentions the China virus, and not for the last time, and boasts about producing the best unemployment numbers for African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Asian Americans ever recorded. I've done more for the African American community than any president since Abraham Lincoln. I have done more in 3 years for the Black community than Joe Biden has done in 47 years. And when I'm reelected, the best is yet to come. Well, yes, again, I don't think that will make that much difference to Black voters. I recall a British reporter, I think from The Guardian, she made an amusing video back in the Michigan primary in 2016, where she buttonholed an elderly Black woman who just come out of voting for the primary, and she asked her, "Who did you vote for?" And the old Black woman said, "Clintron," or whatever her name is. That is to say, it's block voting. It's been block voting for, what, more than half a century, 60, 70, 80 years. It takes a very strong anti-war stance in his speech, Trump does. When I took office, the Middle East was in total chaos. ISIS was rampaging. Iran was on the rise. The war in Afghanistan had no end in sight. I withdrew from the terrible one-sided Iran nuclear deal. And then he talks. There's some Israel talk there. And I think what the high water mark for Jewish vote for a Republican was in the 1984 election when Ronald Reagan got 35%. I think Trump may top that. He continues, Biden's record is a shameful roll call of the most catastrophic betrayals and blunders in our lifetime. He has spent his entire career on the wrong side of history. He voted for the NAFTA disaster, the single worst trade deal ever enacted. He supported China's entry into the World Trade Organization, one of the greatest economic disasters of all time. After those Biden calamities, the United States lost 1 in 4 manufacturing jobs. The laid off workers in Michigan, Ohio, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, and many other states didn't want Joe Biden's hollow words of empathy. They wanted their jobs back. China would own our country if Joe Biden got elected. Unlike Biden, I will hold them fully accountable for the tragedy they caused. And then he talks about when the China virus hit, and he talks up his actions on dealing with COVID-19, pointing out something that the media is not going to tell you, which is that the United States has among the lowest case fatality rates of any major country in the world. The European Union's case fatality rate is nearly 3 times higher than ours. Altogether, the nations of Europe have experienced a 30% greater increase in excess mortality than the United States. Unfortunately, from the beginning, our opponents have shown themselves capable of nothing but a partisan ability to criticize. When I took bold action to issue a travel ban on China, Joe Biden called it hysterical and xenophobic. If we had listened to Joe, hundreds of thousands more Americans would have died. Instead of following the science, Joe Biden wants to inflict a painful shutdown on the entire country. His shutdown would inflict unthinkable and lasting harm on our nation's children, families, and citizens of all backgrounds. The cost of the Biden shutdown would be measured in increased drug overdoses, depression, alcohol addiction, suicides, heart attacks, economic devastation, and more. Joe Biden's plan is not a solution to the virus, but rather a surrender. It makes me wish, and I suppose it makes a lot of people wish that Donald Trump had stuck to his guns at the beginning. Remember when he said that he wanted the America to open up Easter Sunday? Well, if that had happened, the story would be a lot different. Instead, Anthony Fauci and others are talking as if, as the Democratic governors do and the mayors, as if herd immunity is a bad thing. And of course, it's not a bad thing, and the virus is not something that can be eliminated by simply waving that magic wand that Trump apparently has refused to pull out of his desk in the Oval Office. He makes there's a lot of talk of God in his speech. Democrat politicians refuse to protect innocent life, and then they lecture us about morality and saving America's soul. Tonight, we proudly declare that all children, born and unborn, have a God-given right to life. During the Democrat convention, the words "under God" were removed from the Pledge of Allegiance, not once, but twice. The fact is, this is where they are coming from. I learned a long time ago that the Democrats hate it. They become very shirty when their party is called the Democrat Party and not the Democratic Party. I don't know why this is, but I know that Trump deliberately chose to call them the Democrat Party because it would so enrage them. Let's see, when asked if he supports cutting police funding, Joe Biden replied, yes, absolutely. When Congresswoman Ilhan Omar called the Minneapolis Police Department a cancer that is rotten to the root, Biden wouldn't disavow her support and reject her endorsement. He proudly displayed it on his website. Make no mistake, if you give power to Joe Biden, the radical left will defund police departments all over America. They will pass federal legislation to reduce law enforcement nationwide. They will make every city look like Democrat-run Portland, Oregon. No one will be safe in Biden's America. And the Democrats have suddenly become, and their, elite enablers have become terrified about this prospect, and Trump keeps at it. When there is police misconduct, the justice system must hold wrongdoers fully and completely accountable, and it will. But what we can never have in America and must never allow is mob rule. In the strongest possible terms, the Republican Party condemns the rioting, looting, arson, and violence we have seen in Democrat-run cities like Kenosha, Minneapolis, Portland, Chicago, and New York. When the anarchists started ripping down our statues and monuments, I signed an order, 10 years in prison, and it all stopped. During their convention, Joe Biden and his supporters remained completely silent about the rioters and criminals spreading mayhem in Democrat-run cities. In the face of left-wing anarchy and mayhem in Minneapolis, Chicago, and other cities, Joe Biden's campaign did not condemn it. They donated to it. At least 13 members of Joe Biden's campaign staff donated to a fund to bail out vandals, arsonists, looters, and rioters from jail. If the Democrat Party wants to stand with anarchists, agitators, rioters, looters, and flag burners, that is up to them. But I, as your president, will not be part of it. Then he talks about the number of Black Americans killed in just 4 Democrat-run cities. And yeah, I guess he is playing DR3. Democrats are the real racists. But it's true enough that the Democrat agenda of what? Eliminating bail conditions, releasing as many people from prison as possible, and simply not enforcing the law means a much higher death count of Black Americans. And he ends with a list of things that he intends to do in his second term. But he ends, after the list, we get a return to the theme. Our opponents believe that America is a depraved nation. We want our sons and daughters to know the truth. America is the greatest and most exceptional nation in the history of the world. Our country wasn't built by cancel culture, speech codes, and soul-crushing conformity. We are not a nation of timid spirits. We are a nation of fierce, proud, and independent American patriots. We are a nation of pilgrims, pioneers, adventurers, explorers, and trailblazers who refuse to be tied down, held back, or reined in. Americans have steel in their spines, grit in their souls, and fire in their hearts. There is no one like us on earth. Well, you know, 4 years ago, Donald Trump was campaigning on the slogan, "Make America Great Again." And implicit in that phrase is the claim that America was not great anymore. And politicians, of course, do this all the time. That when they are running for office, when they are in the opposition, they claim that things have gone to hell in a handcart. And then when they attain office, suddenly everything is turned around. I mean, it's hypocritical to a certain extent, but these are the things that politicians say. But of course, the fact that the distance between Trump and Biden, the Democrat and Republican candidates for president, is arguably greater than any difference between two candidates in American history. Trump really talked up Americana, Wyatt Earp, Annie Oakley, Davy Crockett, and Buffalo Bill, because you know, I'm sure that the Democrats would find all manner of things to assail those four with. I mean, Davy Crockett, he died at the Alamo. And what was the Alamo but a shameful attempt to steal from Mexico? That's the way the Democrats look at it. How did CNN look at it? Well, I guess you can guess. You know, you can guess what they thought about it. But they brought in Daniel Dale, the former Glee cast member and a Canadian. He actually wasn't a Glee cast member, but he looks very much like a Glee cast member would. And despite his recent decision to start wearing spectacles, he looks like he's 14 years old. And I think he's going to look like 14 for the rest of his life. But he is the king of the fact checkers. And he fact checked up a storm last night. Trump makes more than 20 false or misleading claims in accepting presidential nomination. And you see, Daniel Dale is in possession of the truth. what he says is correct, and there can be no doubting him. The story in CNN begins, President Donald Trump is a serial liar, and he serially lied. During his speech accepting the Republican nomination, CNN counted more than 20 false, exaggerated, or misleading claims from Trump on Thursday night. That's in addition to a number of falsehoods from other speakers. Trump's dishonesty touched on a range of tools, from the economy to his administration's performance during the coronavirus pandemic. Some of Trump's most egregious false claims were directed at Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden. Let's see. Trump boasted about the COVID testing system and his general response to the pandemic, even though experts near universally say the US was fatally slow in its response, especially slow in setting up adequate testing. Yes, you will find experts, and we're hearing more and more from them, saying that the lockdowns everywhere were a dreadful mistake that ended up killing far more people than would have died otherwise. But I mean, who am I to dispute the veracity of the great Daniel Dale? Let's see. Oh, CNN cavils, testing in the US has been less than successful and has never reached levels that satisfy public health experts. After getting off the ground slowly and late, Trump's own CDC director, Dr. Robert Redfield, admits the US has missed 90% of corona cases with its testing effort. On June 25th, he told reporters that the CDC had estimated that there were many more cases than testing had detected. A good rough estimate is now 10 to 1. What Daniel Dale and CNN don't seem to realize is that this argument does not work for them. Because if there are 10 times as many cases, as they call them, of COVID-19, then why has the death toll fallen off to almost nothing, despite their efforts to juice the stats? That is because for the vast majority of people, COVID-19 is not a serious health complaint. It simply isn't. Burn, the English said something about nuggets of gold on a beach. See, and this is outrageous. All right, you can make Trump, but we'll stop here. It's worth noting, though, that Black people themselves do not, on the whole, agree with Trump's self-assessment. Trump has had a consistently abysmal approval rating of Black citizens, just 4%. In one recent Quinnipiac University poll, for example, versus 93% disapproval. What Trump has done or not done for Black Americans has nothing to do with how Black Americans feel about Donald Trump. Black Americans are rats. When you consider whoever he or she might be, this is the kind of response one used to get in Albanian elections. And it's rather disturbing, actually. Oh, and we talk about the border. He's lying about the border wall. This needs context, claim that we've already built 300 miles. The Trump-era replacement barriers are often much larger than the old, where no barriers existed before. This is a lie. I've pictured these barriers. Note that they call them barriers. This was not a wall. Essentially, the gate with some tubes of steel that close. It would be easy to drive a car or a truck through, or simply to over. It was a wall. Fact check of Trump's RNC speech is amazing. Yeah, you could call it. You could call it that. I joked today that watching Dale, interviewed by Anderson Cooper, was so gay that it should have come with a supplement of Truvada. Let's go to the chat. Your new apartment is a real improvement, Kevin. Better lighting, sound, and settings. Yes, it is temporary, but I don't have the money to purchase this place. It's not for rent. Halper says BLM riots driving Black and Hispanic voters to Trump would be some irony. Well, I think that it's likely that gets a huge support from Hispanic voters for reasons. One, just the fact that there are more Hispanics in the United States than Blacks, they are pretty much invisible to the media and to the Democratic Party, who only speak of Hispanics when they're lumping them in with other minorities. And the Democratic Party's wholesale embrace of Black Lives Matter and, frankly, of the looters and arsonists, this does not sit well with Hispanic voters, not well at all. Oh, looks like an abstract painting at this bit rate, says Halper. Oh, dear. Can build a Stonehenge here. I've got the flowers now. As I say, it's rather beige in the background, so I thought that I would brighten it up. Let's see. Racial bloc voting will be America's downfall. Only hope to break up is Trump or Kanye. Democrat is simply not an adjective, says Yo Mama. Dawn from beyond. Each Friday in my Florida town, Trump supporters at busy intersection, flags and signs waving at passing motorists who honk horns in approval. About 80 people today, no face masks. About 10 BLM supporters on opposite corner, dressed in black, waving rainbow flags, all of them white people, and all wearing face masks. LOL. Justin Proto says, today on NPR, they had a tearjerker story about the destruction of the Gulf Coast, but the usual party line about equally destroyed Kenosha. Figured that one out. Let's see. Metal Mike says, Melania insisted that the Obama's toilet be ripped out and replaced. Is that true? Is that true? Trump is uniquely best at reminding Americans about their forebears, said Mike. You see, puts this is laying a trap for the Democrats. That if the Democrats attack the speech because of invocation of America's glorious past, this suggests that they simply hate America. Oh, they were all white people you were talking about. Yes, and your point being, do you hate people? Yo Mama says the Democrats literally booed God. Jason Bryan says they were chanting something blasphemous in Washington, D.C. the other night on live stream, which I will not repeat. I've been watching the riots for 90 plus days in a row now for like 6 to 10 hours every night. Jason Bryan, again, the rioters say the most satanic and hateful things to the cops, to each other, and they're so overtly chaotic and nihilistic, but frame everything they do in love and caring and such. It's insane. Well, yes, they destroy their cities because they love them, presumably, in the same way that before Trump, America's position in the Middle East was, we kill you because we love you. All right. Let's see what else we have here. Jason Bryan, that report is very thorough and contains the jailhouse conversations these suspects have. BT was 100% in on the drug dealing criminal lifestyle of the ex-boyfriends who were both dealers. This is with regard to Breonna Taylor, one of America's recently anointed saints. Hispanics aren't dark enough for the Democrats, says Jason Bryan. It's true. It could be. Nice flowers. You have excellent taste, Mr. Grace. I did not choose the flowers or any of the other furnishings in this place. So let's go to Jim Kunstler. And he noticed the significance of the New York Times article that I talked about at great length yesterday, how chaos in Kenosha is already swaying some voters in Wisconsin. He begins, "It's nice to see the New York Times acting like a whipped dog after hounding the nation year upon year through thickets of falsehood and deceit to put over their hustle of systemic racism. Some worry that local Democratic leaders are failing." Really? Do you think that video showing flash mobs of black looters rampaging through a Target store, busting up cars on a dealer's lot with baseball bats and setting fire to a furniture shop might tell a different story? And that everybody still sane in this land knows that Democratic mayors and governors have been standing back, allowing it to happen? The Democratic Party ought to worry that the voters are onto their game, because it looks like they've completely blown it only a week after anointing the most decrepit old Pole in their donkey stable to run for president. Speaking of whom, Joe Biden finally crawled out from under a rock yesterday to issue a few timid peeps about the rioting, looting, and arson that went on in Kenosha, Wisconsin for 3 nights running, and for 3 months in other cities around the country, during which he said nothing to halt the trashing of Kenosha's downtown. The different story that events themselves are telling voters is that young Americans act like savages when given the green light by politicians who refuse to enforce the laws against public violence, theft, and the destruction of property, and who justify all that with a fabricated narrative about systemic racism. Since Memorial Day, the Democratic Party has used the Black Lives Matter and Antifa orgs as shock troops in a stupid campaign aimed at abolishing the police. Well, now America can see exactly what happens when the police get functionally disabled by mayors and governors who order them to not do their primary job, maintaining basic civic order. The voters have seen it in Kenosha, Chicago, New York, Denver, Minneapolis, Los Angeles, Atlanta, Seattle, and Portland. What were the Democratic Party higher-ups thinking as all this rolled out? That they could keep posing people of color as victims while they ran amok, beat people up, robbed stores, jacked cars, and set buildings on fire? That the mayhem would continue until the nation's morale improved? If that was actually their campaign strategy, then they've successfully burned down their national campaign before it even got underway. Having allowed all this havoc to be set in motion, can they stop it now? I guess we'll see. Thursday was the first night that rioters failed to turn out in Portland after their epic 93-night siege of public buildings and once quiet neighborhoods there. Perhaps someone told them they better knock it off in case voters connected the dots between these orchestrated antics and something Trump might point out in his nationally broadcast acceptance speech. Street operations continued, however, in Washington, D.C., while Trump delivered his remarks at the White House. In it, his speechwriters averred pretty crisply to those forces driving to punish the wicked nation for its sins. Meanwhile, Democratic Party water carrier Jake Tapper over at CNN howled about the president violating the Hatch Act by using government property, the White House, where he lives, to stage a campaign event, making the CNN talking heads look ridiculous in the process. When that act ran out of steam, the panel carried on about the assembled audience on the White House lawn not wearing masks as proof of the manifest evil in the GOP ranks. Then a BLM mob beset Senator Rand Paul attempting to walk back to his hotel after the speech. DC police had to step in and escort him to safety. Earlier on Thursday, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi decreed that there should be no candidates debates between Biden and Trump, though Biden had previously agreed to it. It looked like mommy ran out of the basement to save his skin. That can only confirm how desperate the party is now, having set their own campaign tent on fire. Expect them to jam Joe Biden back under a rock for the duration. The question is, the duration of what? Of the interval between now and the dreadful moment in early September when they realize they must replace him at the head of the ticket, or else witness the suicide of the party? Jonathan Chait, who writes for a New York magazine, is very, very disturbed. He wrote yesterday, Democrats need to be extremely concerned about what's happening in Wisconsin, where support for BLM has gone from plus 25 to plus 0 in 2 months. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. So this is how the elite reacted? To people who said it's a complete collapse of civic order in America, their reaction was, who gives a shit? And this was followed by, our poll numbers are cratering. It's an emergency now. Yes, it's all meta now. It is all entirely meta. No one is interested in what's actually happening. It's just the spin. How can this be spin? Let's see. Politico. It's a similar story. It's playing into Trump's hands. Dems fear swing state damage from Kenosha unrest. Unrest. Some Wisconsin Democrats worry that the images of violence and destruction will turn suburban voters against the party. And there is, this is illustrated with a picture of a burned out truck, a burned out semi. Downtown buildings set ablaze by arsonists were still smoldering from the night before when Kirk Ingram started to paint an angel on his boarded up storefront. Ingram, a Democrat who runs a massage therapy business, said the war zone images of his city on TV, armed people running through the streets, burned cars, and broken windows were bolstering Trump's get tough message. Maybe a few uplifting murals could start to tell a different story about Kenosha, Ingram said Wednesday. Well, you know my view of murals, that they are a signifier, and what they signify is you do not want to live here. Just downtown San Diego, it's deserted, but there are lots of murals there. There's a huge one on the main street downtown, which is illustrated with the uplifting words from Chief Seattle. This is all made up, of course, but never mind. Trump has attempted to frame the violent unrest in the wake of Jacob Blake's shooting as fallout from inept leadership and the inability of Democrats to take control of their cities. On Wednesday, he announced he would send in the National Guard while criticizing Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers for not doing so, even though the Democrat had deployed Guard troops on Monday and increased them on subsequent days. As this battleground state grapples with social unrest, some Democrats fear that the looting and rioting and clashes are feeding Trump's argument that this is what life would be like under the so-called radical left. The worry is that especially among suburban swing voters, the more upheaval and violence they witness, the more their sympathy for peaceful Black Lives Matter protesters will wane. And there's a picture of Kirk Ingram and next to a mural, "Make me an instrument of your peace." There's a picture of Jesus holding a staff. And I see that Kirk Ingram, despite being outside, is wearing a mask. Why is he wearing a mask outside? Why is he doing that? There's no doubt it's playing into Trump's hand, said Paul Soglin, who served as mayor of Madison on and off for more than 2 decades. There's a significant number of undecided voters who are not ideological, and they can move very easily from Republican to the Democratic column and back again. They are, in effect, the people who decide elections, and they are very distraught about both the horrendous carnage created by police officers in murdering African Americans and for the safety of their communities. I actually think that they're more concerned for the safety of their communities and their own personal safety than, say, for George Floyd or Breonna Taylor. It's pro forma. Oh, yes, George Floyd is outrageous, absolutely outrageous. And then, having said that, you can stop thinking about it. Trump, of course, is positioning himself as the antidote to urban unrest. So let me be clear. The violence must stop, whether in Minneapolis, Portland, or Kenosha, VP Mike Pence declared in his Republican convention speech Wednesday night, with Trump looking on. We will have law and order on the streets of this country for every American of every race and creed and color. Republicans had chided Joe Biden and other Democrats for not calling out the violence in the aftermath of the Blake shooting. Biden immediately addressed the shooting, but he didn't condemn the ensuing violence until Wednesday in a video posted on social media. But meanwhile, you have Nancy Pelosi saying, people are going to do what people are going to do. It's those crazy kids. Outrage in Wisconsin over the Blake shooting reverberated beyond the streets of Kenosha into the world of sports. Oh, boo, groan, hiss. Where players for the Milwaukee Bucks NBA team took the extraordinary step of boycotting a playoff game. No, actually, they forfeited the game, but this was reversed after political intervention. The move set off a wave of other sports game cancellations, ensuring the Blake shooting and its aftermath would touch many more Americans. Yes, it's going to touch many more Americans who are going to decide, I'm cutting the cable because I'm being charged for all these sports, and I'm not too happy with professional sports right now. Of course, others are absolutely furious about this. Oh, apparently hockey is not doing enough. Of course, when the NHL picked someone to bleat about systemic racism and the like, they couldn't even find a black man. They had to find a man who was described in the media yesterday as someone who identifies as being Filipino. The National Guard ought to be on the corners right now, fumed resident Ron Dooley, who said he was on his way to check whether his favorite diner had been burned down. Look at this, he said, pointing to blocks of boarded up storefronts. It looks like I'm in the slums of LA. You do not want voters thinking this. Ingram said Trump was already trying to capitalize on the city's anxieties, the opportunism of Trump in this swing state. He's already pounced on that. He has already shot his big stream of gasoline on the flames here. This Ingram fellow is obviously a shitlib. And this is shitlib logic that to decry violence, destruction, and the lack of authorities to deal with it, this apparently is pouring fuel on the fire. Should never have said that. It's irresponsible. Ingram noted that Trump hadn't spoken about the racism that protesters believe was at play when a police officer shot Blake, a black man, multiple times in the back in front of his young children. Rioters set fires afterwards, and on Tuesday, 3 people were shot, 2 fatally. Kyle Rittenhouse, a 17-year-old from Illinois, was charged in the killings. Trump has made many statements decrying racism in the United States, and he has said many times that police officers will be held accountable for their behavior. I don't know what more he could do. Well, actually, he could, go on record as saying that, all cops are bastards, I suppose, which is the Democrat position. He tries to, Billy Stevens, an African-American man who was helping paint the murals, agreed that the violence and destruction on display in the city give Trump more to point to in his re-election campaign. He tries to paint a picture of Democratic leaders being weak. Personally, I think it's divisive in times like these. Yes, again, this is the meta response. The violence itself, righteous anger. Pointing to the violence and saying this is bad and must stop, divisive. Now we're sending in more troops for a large show of force immediately. I do think it's needed right now. The feelings and political dimensions playing out here, however, are far more complex than left versus right or pro-Biden versus pro-Trump. Some residents said they're disillusioned with politicians and people in authority, no matter their political ideology. I always knew this was coming, man, said Ronald Grover, who lives across the street from a high school that's boarded up and protected by police squads. Then, gesturing at the downtown that had been ransacked by looters, he added, they just need to let this vent. Yeah. So if the rioters decide to show up in front of your house and they make it clear they're going to burn it down to the ground, should he just let it vent? Grover's wife, Liz Parsilis, stood watch on their porch with a Glock 43 stuffed into her waistband. She said she needed to protect her family because she didn't trust law enforcement to do it. The night before, the couple watched a parade of people march by with semi-automatic weapons as she warned her 11-year-old son to stay low when he heard explosions or gunfire. So Ronald Grover is a black man and his wife is a white woman. And there's a picture of her with her purple Glock stuffed in her waistband. Yeah, and there's much more of this. The Democrats are being sent a message by the media, which is you got to pivot here. You have really got to pivot because this is not looking good for Joe Biden and for the party across the board. Who's responsible for what is going on in Kenosha? Well, there have been rumors from the start that this is directed by outside agents, most likely paid by George Soros. The internet is full of now people bleating about these caregivers who were arrested in Kenosha. This is from Fox News. Kenosha police arrested 9 people traveling in vehicles with out-of-state license plates Wednesday on suspicion of criminal conduct amid the civil unrest occurring in the city. Officials said they received a tip about the vehicles. When officers found them, a bread truck, a black school bus, and minivan, they followed the occupants, a police news release said. The department did not specify which states the license plates were from. While under police surveillance, the group stopped at a gas station and attempted to fill up multiple fuel cans, the statement said. The people inside the bread truck and school bus were detained. The minivan drove away but was stopped a short time later, police said. Officers forced their way into the vehicle and arrested those inside. Inside the vehicles, officers found fireworks, helmets, gas masks, protective vests, and suspected controlled substances. The 9 people were arrested on suspicion of disorderly conduct. Traveling, crossing state lines, a criminal conspiracy, RICO. I think that Trump's Department of Justice is all over this. And to a large extent, these protests have been astroturfed. But that's the same in all protests now, is it not? Let's see. Let's talk a little bit about COVID-19, which I guess is a dying story. The media and the left and what the public health officials want everyone to be terrified for the rest of their lives. But the good news is I think that they're not going to be able to get away with it. Alex Berenson tweets, has anyone else noticed that the team apocalypse shrieking for a second and harder lockdown has basically ended? I guess at some point the reality of charts like this become too embarrassing to ignore, but it was close. Remember this insanity from A. Slavitt only a month ago? Yes, this is what he said on July the 26th. So let's define the kitchen sink. Start with universal mask wearing. We didn't do this in March to April, and let's chalk it up to faulty instructions. But we know better now. Keep the bars and restaurants and churches and transit closed. All hotspots. Prohibit interstate travel. Prohibit travel into the country. No one will let us into their country, so that shouldn't be hard. Have hotels set up to allow people with symptoms to isolate from their families at no cost. Instead of a 50% lockdown, which is what we did in March and April, I guess 100% lockdown? Lockdowns don't work because unless you're going to entomb these people, they are going to be out and about eventually. Berenson suggests the organizing of a day of normality, large outdoor unmasked gatherings in city parks around the country, maybe for Labor Day. That's an excellent idea. Jeremy B. White tweeted, California not completely abandoning ICU and hospitalization data. We're just not leading with those criteria as positive test numbers become critical metrics, says Governor Gavin Newsom. Berenson replies, Whiskey Tango Foxtrot. The governor of California might as well just say it. I will use any excuse to prevent life from returning to normal. What is it going to take to open schools and end this nonsense? Riots? Those do seem to be the flavor of the month. Yes, Florida reported COVID deaths. August the 7th, 180. August the 14th, 229. August 21st, 121. Today, 89. Virus gonna virus, and when virus is done virusing, it's done. Of course, we've heard a lot about science and the alleged rejection of said science by certain politicians. It is not scientific, as far as I understand science, to declare that a virus can be faced down. Yeah, I'm going to show you what's what, COVID-19. We are determined. We are going to take you outside and, knock you around. And then you'll know better to threaten us. That's not how viruses work. From the British Medical Journal, British scientists examined 651 children compared to 69,000 adults admitted to 260 UK hospitals with COVID infections. A total of 6 kids died, all of whom had profound comorbidity. Open schools now, open kids' sports now. Every death is a tragedy, but for teachers' unions, politicians, and the media to use these deaths as an excuse to deny school to healthy children is disgusting and unfair. It is obvious now that the risk of COVID to ordinary kids is so low as to be almost unmeasurable. The teachers have really got the bit between their teeth that they are going to be paid forever for not working or for working an hour or two a day. They really think that this is going to happen. Toby Young writes in Lockdown Skeptics, mass gatherings back on in Sweden. Another step back to normality for the country that brazenly refused to lock down. From Reuters, Swedish concert goers and soccer fans are going to be allowed back in venues from October after the country's health agency accepted a government proposal to raise the limit for some events to 500 from the current 50. With the number of new infections and COVID-19 deaths falling in Sweden, the government said last week it planned to introduce exceptions to the 50-person maximum. The ban on gatherings over 50, a Young comments, was one of the few social distancing measures Sweden made compulsory, though at least Swedes could still gather in groups of up to 50 throughout the epidemic, unlike in the UK, where we were placed under effective house arrest for over 2 months. In England, gatherings over 30 are still prohibited, with exceptions for schools and workplaces. And while the government is aiming to bring back sports events from October the 1st, uncertainty hangs over this, with Chief Medical Officer Chris Whitty even warning that we may have to shut pubs to open schools. Yeah, I'd like to see the logical chain that goes from shutting pubs to opening schools. Do they have to shut the pubs because otherwise the children won't go to school and they'll be in the pubs getting drunk? Is that the idea? The once maligned herd immunity is getting better press every day as more and more people accept it's the only real way out of this debacle. Dr. John Lee has one of his typically incisive analyses in The Spectator this week, where he writes, a lot of emphasis is being placed on the presence of antibodies. If you test negative, then you're at risk. This would be alarming true, especially as official figures show just 6 Brits have tested positive for antibodies kill virally infected cells. Interestingly, some studies have shown that up to 60% of people apparently never exposed to COVID-19 still have cells that reacted to the virus, suggesting that you might not need the virus to have protection from it. It's a huge important theory, but T-cell responses are harder to measure than antibodies, so they are not being widely tested. The coronavirus epidemic could go into continuous decline when around 20% of the population has developed antibodies, regardless of lockdown or social distancing. The prospect of herd immunity is looking more achievable for many. News that reinfection is possible has been countered by scientists pointing out that they never thought otherwise. But that doesn't mean there's no hope of herd immunity. And this is with no underlying conditions. And it's 99 for 10 to 29-year-olds, to 39-year-olds, 40 to 49-year-olds, 50 to 59-year-olds, 60 to 69-year-olds, 70 to 79-year-olds, and for those who are 80 and above, with no underlying the chance of surviving COVID is for women 98.9% and for men 96.3%. So yes, we're all going to die. Never on the table, which again suggests that there's an agenda at work. Young is really the virus that has brought the world to its knees. Michael Bayer has posted on Twitter a table from Sweden showing the likelihood of surviving COVID-19 broken down by age, sex, and underlying conditions. Most of the population has over 99.99% chance of survival, and even among the very highest risk group of men over 80s with underlying conditions, around 4 out of 5 survive. The average age of those who die is 84. So effective has Project Fear been that the public thinks the death toll is over 100 times worse than it is. No doubt COVID can be nasty, especially if you're in a high-risk group, but so are many illnesses, and as viruses go, SARS-CoV, the government needs to take the lead on dialing down the panic, not stoking it up. Who's going to be held responsible for this disaster? Is anyone going to be held responsible? Because it's the trend. Decades, people are never held responsible for any disasters. Oh yes, we followed advice given to us by experts. An inquiry will place the blame where it should lay. A government minister says in A Clockwork Orange. This is not my fault. I'm the person in charge, but it's not my fault. It's other people. It's their fault. Now, the fact that the people dying from COVID-19 have been typically around the age of 85 has been known pretty much right from the beginning of this pandemic, but that knowledge was simply ignored. It was decided that we all must suffer. What killed everyone else? Toby Young asks. According to the ONS, during the height of the epidemic in the UK, 2 out of every 5 excess deaths, or 16,000, were from causes other than with COVID, most of them as a result of lack of access to medical care. This disturbing picture is coming into sharper focus now as more data comes in. The Telegraph's Laura Donnelly reports that the number of heart attacks detected and treated fell by 40% during the pandemic, while the number of deaths from heart attacks spiked by a similar amount. The Times estimates that there are 15.3 million people currently on NHS waiting lists in need of follow-up appointments for health problems. Is it any wonder the government's own report predicted 200,000 deaths due to lockdown? And that is to say nothing of the hundreds of millions globally who will starve because of the lockdowns and economic collapse. Has a cure ever been so much worse than the disease? And Ross Clark in the Telegraph asked the question, did protect NHS actually cost lives? You know the answer. Oh, let's have a little bit of liberty here. Owen Jones, who was a, 40-something twink, who is considered Britain's leading leftist. He is very, very angry about Britain making any kind of a semblance of effort to get back to normal. No, we can't have that. And there is a picture of a comely young woman in an orange t-shirt, some sort of vest, is wearing a mask and holding this that says, "Don't cancel us." What's this say? Orange outrage. We've lost me. Like the people who want to lock down forever have started wearing the color orange. Today, the Daily Telegraph, Owen Jones writes, carries a front-page advert for Britain's embattled trade union movement. Not intentionally, you understand, but this morning's splash, "Go back to work or risk losing your job," is the punchiest recent illustration of the need for workers to collectively organize. Thanks to the British government's bungled response to the pandemic, of course, the initial decision to delay lockdown in a self-defeating attempt to protect the economy, many workers are reasonably concerned about the consequences of a premature dash back to offices. These workers may have noticed, for instance, that their country has been one of the world's worst hit, with England posting Europe's highest rate of excess deaths in the first months of the crisis. As a result, they may be naturally skeptical of this government's competence when it comes to controlling the pandemic and protecting their families. Pandemics cannot be controlled. How many times does this need to be said? What should have been done with COVID-19 is to make sure that the most vulnerable, that is to say, old people in old age homes or long-term care facilities, were protected or isolated. Instead, the exact opposite approach was taken. And Owen Jones doesn't seem to notice that when he's talking about England posting Europe's highest rate of excess death, that there are two reasons for this. One, the lockdown, and two, the fact that COVID-19 became the only disease that was being treated in England. Oh, for some reason, the right-wing press doesn't regard this as a tough verdict on the pathetic performance of its good friends in government. Rather than number paper decided to accuse the public of a number of these workers are going to what? They're going to drive to work and they're risk every single all human activity on a rabbit on Wikipedia last night, and I looked up János Starker, who was a acclaimed cellist originally from Hungary. I have a great many of his recordings, his Bach suites for solo cello, as well as many concert works by various composers. He recorded for many years for the Mercury label. If you spend a lot of time at Wikipedia, you will know that someone or some group of people violently opposed to tobacco will insert in the entries the fact that a dead person smoked or drank or both. And let's see, under personal habits, it said Starker was a lifelong smoker with a 60 cigarette per day habit. He also drank copious amounts of Scotch whiskey. He once refused to perform a concert in Columbia, South Carolina, that he was supposed to play because he was not allowed to smoke his pre-concert cigarette backstage. So János Starker was taken from us, what, in his 30s, 40s, 50s? He lived to be 88 years old. And I found a video of him, which I put up on Twitter last night, teaching a masterclass when he was 81 years old. So despite the fact that he supposedly had a 60 cigarette a day habit, which is 3 packs a day, I rather doubt that he kept this up into his 60s, 70s, and 80s. But it would seem that at least this case, that smoking 3 packs a day and drinking copious amounts of whiskey are not sufficient to keep you from living till the age of 88. Oh, yes. Yeah, I'll go back to the chat now. The Ballad of Kyle the Kid. Yes, I noticed there's a bunch of musical tributes to him in the style of what, Marty Robbins? I learned recently that apparently that Marty Robbins is all the rage among the kids. I'm not making this up. I'm not making this up. Our valiant moderator, Chad Chanson, says, I was at a Back the Blue event last week in Portland, and the only masks worn by Antifa were gas masks. Some of the not so Antifa folks, crazies, were just running around naked. Yeah, seems to be a very high crazy to normal people ratio in these peaceful Portland protests. A movie could be made of Kyle's day. He spent morning at lifeguard job, the afternoon scrubbing graffiti off buildings then. He's St. Kyle now, says Chad. Portland cops must have nicknames for all the Antifa, says Hauper. Let's see. Feeding the wildlife is forbidden almost everywhere and for good reason, says Brandon Smith. Apparently, Grosskreuz's buddy said that Grosskreutz told him he intended to kill Kyle but hesitated. Okay, so the other fellow, Rosenbaum was the convicted pedophile. And now we find out that this younger fellow, Beardy, whose death is being sobbed over on the internet. What a hell of a guy he was. From the New York Daily News, Kenosha shooting victims identified, remembered as sweet, loving guys by family and friends. And there are pictures of Joseph Rosenbaum, 36, and Anthony Huber, 26. And there are some responses from Carly Ashmus. Anthony was a POS, sorry, not sorry. He drugged me in high school and forced himself on me and only stopped because I started puking. And everyone is calling this bitch an effing hero. And similar comments. Well, yeah, I've speculated earlier on, how many of these people involved in these protests, on the violent side, how many of them are sexual deviants? Violent sexual deviants, sexual criminals. There seems to be quite a correlation there. And, okay, back to the chat. Is feeding them drugs and paraphernalia like needles any different? Homeless people in San Francisco are being given booze and drugs by the city, as well as free apartments. It's, of course, in Victoria, which I left a couple of weeks ago, free apartments for the homeless people. Victoria is a pretty expensive city in Canadian terms, but I guess if you don't work, then you garner the benefits. Why else would you do booze? Can't be seen to commit suicide, says Ritual Romanum. Marty Robbins is a good choice, said Dan Allison. Visionary Companion says Serge Gainsbourg smoked too much. He made a point of being grotesque about it. The biography by an English woman about him, which I mean to read, maybe I'll talk about on the book club, is called A Fistful of Gitanes. Someone here, Yo Mama, says Grosskreutz is the Satanist. Jim Smith says the Starker story reminds me of 20 years ago reading of the death of the oldest person in the world, a woman in France who died at 117. When asked the usual question, she said nothing unusual except that she stopped smoking at 111. Chogokin 666, his girlfriend has an arrest warrant and is trying to guide the funds directly to her. Mike F, Antifa needs to start vetting new members better to weed out people with checkered past. No, I mentioned this before, but these people are dupes. They're patsies. Because what do they think that the revolution is going to bring them? Is it going to bring them, a high-paying job? Is it going to bring them, status, worldly success? No, I don't think so. I mean, all of these, the Twitter is, weeping an ocean of tears over the 3 people shot by Kyle Rittenhouse in Kenosha. But, better them than me. That's the attitude of their enablers. If these people are stupid enough, to get into gun battles on the street, well, that's the price you got to pay. Jason Bryan says homelessness is 100% planned. They're going to become a 5th column. The community leaders who hand out the drugs will have de facto control over a legion of loyal drug addict soldiers. I had occasion over the years to speak to a great many homeless in Victoria at the Salvation Army. And I was rather surprised to find that a fair number of them told me that they slept rough by choice. One of them who he'd been successful in life, and in his 40s, it all started to come apart for him. He admitted that he had a problem with authority. That's the way he put it. And that he did not want a social worker telling him what to do. Now, the fact that, accommodation would have been found for him, that he would have been put on welfare or disability, he he just didn't want it because he didn't want to be in a position where he couldn't choose to do what he wanted to do. And as I say, I met quite a few men who told me a similar story. My trail of disgrace says there's a disconcerting number of pedophiles and other sex criminals in Antifa and BLM, i.e. Luke Kuhn. Brandon Smith, dope fiends can be pretty relentless, useful idiots. My trail of disgrace again, Post-Millennial published a piece entitled Antifa Has a Pedophile Problem. Let's see, Chogokin 666, well, what do they get? This person's answer, they gain sensation, excitement, and a sense of importance. They're less than useless humans. They're basically mutants. Hauper says, I guess all cops really are bastards when they keep busting you for sex crimes. Again, Chogokin 666, most bums are bums for a reason. Yeah. At the Salvation Army, I saw a number of people whose lives had obviously been wrecked by drugs and or alcohol. But I think a large, the homeless crisis, if you will, is the result of changing mores more than anything else. Because homelessness was not really tolerated in the past. And there was a sense of shamefulness, a deep shame, of course, worked to make people not find themselves in that situation. In Victoria, Victoria seems to have made itself the most homeless-friendly city in Canada, with the result that people literally travel thousands of miles to go to Victoria. Victoria is also the Canadian city with the mildest climate in the country, which helps. But they're everywhere now. And the word has to get out. People are not going to spend their tourist dollars in a place which is infested with homeless people, many of whom are deranged and wander the streets screaming gibberish and obscenities, or engaging in random acts of violence, punching through windows and the like, kicking signs over. It's exceedingly unpleasant as I, my last place I stayed in Victoria, this hotel on Douglas Street. I guess Douglas Street has been bad for a long time. I commissioned a cover story in BC Report on Victoria in the late 1990s because there have been some horrific incidents. But it's just the people who run the city have decided that, well, no, Douglas Street is going to be horrendous, and that's just the way it's going to be. I take pleasure in inflicting misery on people. I really do. Because, no, this is bad for all sorts of reasons. So I have to put a stop to it. No, we're not going to do that. Well, why not? Oh, because that's what they want us to do. Oh, yeah, those evil right-wingers and white supremacists and the like. Formed supremacist gang in prison turned out a pedo. Brandon Smith was on the street for a while in Port Alberni. Jason Bryan says, easy to get back on your feet, the willpower to do so. I'm doing well and now and live back Vancouver. I'm convinced like 90% of homeless addicts are by choice. They like the life. Chogokin 666 could never understand seasonal crust punks on the Lower East Side asking for change. How can you humiliate yourself? Well, the shame has been pretty much banned from our society, except in a political sense. That there are many people who support Donald Trump, for instance, but they would never admit it. Not to a pollster, maybe not even to anyone, because that is considered to be shameful. Now, in terms of personal behavior, no. Shame has vanished. I'm going to be talking about reality TV in the context of Jimmy Savile, but reality TV is all about people humiliating themselves in front of audiences of hundreds of thousands or millions for profit. And this is something that it's come to the fore during my lifetime. Jerry Springer first came on the air, it was almost unbelievable. Where do these people come from? Where does he find these people? And I guess, there was an element of mockery about these people and their miserable, horrific situations. But, as time went on, it became a celebration of these people. They're out there on the edge. They're rewriting the rules about what's acceptable. John Stuart Mill argued that social sanctions were as bad or worse than legal sanctions. And this is something which has been fully embraced by the libertarians. Of course, the libertarians have no political support. They have never had any political support, but they have a lot of support amongst big business and in the media. And no, we can't have people going with regard to any kind of behavior that is wickedness, because it hurts feelings. It used to be that in cities of any size there would be a bohemian district, and there were rules that, all right, you want to live a weirdo life, you go to Bohemia and live the weirdo life, but there's a trade-off there. The trade-off is that we're not going to say that we agree with what you're doing, that we admire you, that what you're doing is a good idea, and you are exiling yourself from decent society by living in Bohemia. We are now nations of Bohemians who insist upon being applauded for their activities. The idea that drag queens would become a political force, in American politics and Canadian politics, it's really shocking. But that's what's happened. Brandon Smith says a slim majority are genuinely mentally deranged without any addictions. A visionary companion, Murger's story ends with a girl starving to death due to her artistically manic boho friends' obliviousness. So that's a reference to the opera La Bohème. Well, yes, it was. I guess it was shocking. It was titillating, that there's these people, out there on the edge, starving in garrets, starving for their art. But you wouldn't want to be one of those people. No, you like a warm room, and you like, food in your stomach, normal things like that. De Boreas says Alzheimer's cure must be into tobacco, LOL. Well, I've seen this for quite some time, that apparently nicotine is a prophylactic against Alzheimer's. Rent explains a lot, says Yo Mama. Shame only works on conscientious people, said Brandon Smith. Well, what do we have now? We have fat shaming, slut shaming, all these different kinds of shaming, and the planted axiom there is any kind of shaming is wrong. I mean, if you have a 400-pound person complaining about his or her medical problems, how about if you lose about 250 pounds, right? How about you start with that, okay? Because you're killing yourself. But no one is supposed to point that out, that you have chosen a way of life where you are killing yourself. But and rather quickly too, Having poor physical health is a real barrier to helping yourself, says Octopus Knight. Try pulling yourself up with bootstraps with the constant pain of a rotten tooth or worse. No, that's true enough. It's certainly true enough. But as I say, a great many of these people that I saw as homeless in Victoria, they had made the journey there. A great many of them come from Ontario, Quebec, or even further east, because I guess to these people, Victoria is the big rock candy mountain, as they used to sing about back in the Depression days. Jason Bryan, society was better when bullying existed. No, I think it's absolutely true that bullying now, everyone is against bullying. bullying is essentially, and in most cases, simply enforcing social sanctions. That's what it is. I mean, obviously, bullying can go too far, but look back a couple of generations when children organized their own activities, when children would play their own sports, and all children did this, and there were no adults in charge. Well, I want to talk about a woman who has suffered greatly. Milana, women in the house, right? And they're all joking about how hideous this woman is going to be. And then Milana Weintraub shows, because this is a fine looking, gorgeous woman, let's say big breasts. And, when I say big breasts, I mean like really big breasts. And like foil, that shabby guy with the hair and the beard, how did he get a girlfriend like this? And then I found out that she has been appearing for years on AT&T commercials. And so I guess I didn't have American TV, or, I just couldn't wait to see them pop up, randomly. So I watched a bunch of them, and she plays a helpful AT&T employee, a very different character than the one she played on Silicon Valley, where she is very, very modest in her appearance and behavior. And I guess commercials had the desired effect, which was look at this young woman. I thought, I love AT&T now. But it's not all beer and Skittles. Milana Weintraub, who appeared on a series of popular commercials of the company between 2013 and 2016, returned to the role earlier this year. As a result of the campaign's visibility, she's encountered a flood of objectifying and concerning memes that violate her privacy. Why are you making those if you're worried about your privacy? Instagram is about. It's pretty much boasting about their vacation, about their clothes, boasting about the expense of shoes and handbags they have, boasting about the food that they eat at certain restaurants and the designer drinks that they consume. Yes, exactly. You go on Instagram because you want to maintain your privacy. In any event, she described the sexual harassment in both her comments and the official AT&T accounts. She candidly details the emotional damage on the stream. Trolls vividly flood the comments with the exact messages she's decrying. Weintraub claims that some social media accounts distorted old images in viral Twitter and Instagram memes, leading to a swell in abusive messages, and described how impossible to regulate and report these on her own. Quote, "Let me tell you, I'm not consenting to any of this. I do not want any of this. The photos that have come out of me are super cleavagey, are from a pool party I went to in college over a decade ago. I mean, report them all. Honestly, it's like there are so many more of them than I have time to report." She's not being honest here, because if you see her appearance, the episode where she moves into the programmer's house, the super cleavage, yes. And there are many, many minutes being super cleavagey. A recent article from Insider details a surge in abusive comments directed towards Weintraub after an objectifying post went viral on Twitter last week. Users descended on the AT&T Instagram account, which had recently posted a Lily commercial. The spot accumulated over 1 million views, in addition to a flood of milk emojis and other predatory messages. I don't know how a milk emoji can be seen as a predatory message. For comparison's sake, a Justice League commercial posted to AT&T account on Wednesday currently has 6,000 views. Yes, the AT&T lady speaking out on y'all horny weirdos. Guys, please grow up. It's actually dehumanizing, and she's saying she doesn't like it. Yeah, I suppose it's the price one pays, that Jane Mansfield got worse. Dick Cavett, a talk show host who was beloved by the liberals, he was a gag writer, and Jane Mansfield was appearing Tonight Show, Steve Allen Show, or something like that, and he wrote this line: "Here they are, Jane Mansfield," which is very nasty indeed. But if you're a woman with big breasts and a sweet face like Milana Weintraub, you're going to attract a lot of attention from both men and women, and some of it is going to be flattering, and some of it is not going to be flattering. I mean, there's a strong element of humble bragging to this. Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, some years ago, she gave the State of the State address in a dress that was far too small for her, which resulted in her nipples being exposed and her navel also being exposed. And then she went off in a rant about sexism and, oh, yes, I've been picked on because of my large breasts since I was, 12 years old? Yes, that poor girl. That poor girl. Mike says, it's incredibly disheartening that Weintraub is forced to vouch for herself in this way against an immovable army of trolls. No matter how much time social media platforms and companies have had to prepare against deeply entrenched misogyny and sustained abuse, they're no closer to protecting their users and employees from harm. Look, as soon as Milana Weintraub made it clear that she thought that these milk emojis and the like were horrible, we were going to get more and more and more of them. I mean, am I supposed to believe that a woman as young as her doesn't know how social media works? Again, there are many millions of women who would gladly change places with Milana Weintraub. A woman like her has had people, men as well as women, sort of bending over backwards for her entire life. And I suspect, oh, yes, I wish I were a normal person, a plain person. No, I don't think you'd like that very much. I really don't, considering the gilded life that you have led. It's time, a quick look at the chat. Yes, John S. Turn off your iPhone, lady. LOL, just get off Instagram, girl. Yes, this is the famous Tyler, the Creator response, which I'm not going to quote because it would get me banned. I believe it's still up on Twitter, though. The woman thing isn't going well, especially in politics, says Rituale Romanum. Chogakin 666, even moderately attractive fat girls of hundreds of thousands of Instagram followers. Yeah, it's bewildering. Donald Robertson says, we had come to enjoy our own self-supervised sports so much that we grew to despise politically charged and ego-driven organized sports, causing most of us dropped out of organized sports in or before high school. I don't know. I don't know much about this Milana Weintraub woman, except that she has strong political opinions. Oh, she's all for the migrants invading Europe. I guess she migrated from Uzbekistan when she was 3 years old or something to the United States. So therefore, everyone in the world must be allowed to overrun Europe or overrun America, because that's perfectly logical. So the book club this week is Jimmy Savile, A Life of Jimmy Savile by Dan Davis, and it's called In Plain Sight, The Life and Lives of Jimmy Savile. Here is the most fascinating thing about this book. No major publisher would publish it. Dan Davis spent hundreds or thousands of hours interviewing Jimmy Savile, or just being in his company. He had started doing research on Jimmy Savile from the time that he was a teenager. He had a massive dossier of press cuttings about him. This book is rigorously researched and footnoted, but no British publisher of any stature would take it. And keep that in mind when you hear people, chuckling smugly about those idiots who believe in QAnon. You see, by the time this book was published, Jimmy Savile had become a devil figure. He had been dogged by rumors of pedophilia for most of his adult life, but this had been confirmed after his death. But no publisher would touch this book. Why not? Why not? It's a guaranteed money spinner. There was an essay in the London Review of Books 8 years ago by Andrew O'Hagan called Light Entertainment. And it was written before Dan's book came out. It really gives an insight into the culture that created Jimmy Savile and made him a star. Oberyn Waugh used to write repeatedly that the English, are always congratulating themselves, great love of children, whereas Waugh was actually convinced the British hate children. And one looks at the efforts by various government bodies and police forces and the BBC to cover up Jimmy Savile's crimes over decades. It would be difficult not to come to the conclusion that there is a tremendous hatred of children in Britain. O'Hagan writes, one of the qualities of the journey from radio to television was personality. Suddenly, you had these human beings who were ultra everything. They were funnier and quicker and smarter than you. On television, they were prettier too. At the BBC, these people became like gods, even the weird ones, even the ones whom everyone could tell were deranged. They had personality, and that was the gold standard. Soon enough, the notion of men being men was extended institutionally into that's just Frankie being Frankie or Jimmy being Jimmy. We never asked whether a certain derangement was a crucial part of their talent. And so you open Pandora's box to find the seedy ingredients of British populism. It's not just names or performers or acts, it's an ethos. Why is British light entertainment so often based on the sexualization of people too young to cope? And why is it that we have a press so keen to feed off it? Is it to cover the fact via some kind of willed outrage that the culture itself is largely pedophile in its commercial and entertainment excitements? Millie Dowler's phone was hacked by journalists cynically feeding the ravenous appetites of 3 million people who love that stuff, and that's just the ones who actually bought the news of the world. When Levison's findings are duly buried, will we realize that it was the nation's populist appetites that were on trial all along? We're not allowed to say it because we love our tots, or should I say, we love our tots. We know we do because the mirror tells us we do. But would you please get out of the way because you're blocking my view of another 14-year-old crying her eyes out on the X Factor as a bunch of adults shatter her dreams? Savile went to work in light entertainment and thrived there. Of course he did, because those places were custom built for men who wanted to dandle dreaming kids on their knees. If you grew up during the golden era of British television, the 1970s, when light entertainment was tapping deep into the national unconscious, particularly the more perverted parts, you got used to grown-up men like Rod Hull clowning around on stage with a girl like Lena Zavaroni. You got used to Huey Green holding the little girl's hand and asking her if she wanted an ice cream. Far from wanting an ice cream, the little girl was starving herself to death while helpfully glazing over for the camera and throwing out her hands and singing, "Mama, he's making eyes at me." She was 13. There's something creepy about British light entertainment, and there always has been. Joe Orton meets the Marquis de Sade at the end of the pier with a few Union Jacks fluttering in the stink and a mother-in-law tied in bunting to a ducking stool. Those of us who grew up on it liked its oddness without quite understanding how creepy it was. I mean, Benny Hill. And then we wake up one day in 2012 and wonder why so many of them turned out to be deviants and weirdos. Our papers explode in outrage, and we put on our crucible expressions before setting off to the graveyard to take down the celebrity graves and break them up for landfill. Of course, graffiti the plaques and take down the statues, because the joy of execration must match the original sin. When we made heroes out of these damaged and damaging entertainers, we suddenly wish them to be normal, when all we ever ask of our celebrities is they be much more fucked up than we are. And what do we do now? Do we burn the commemorative programs, scratch their names from the national memory? The public made Jimmy Savile. It loved him. It knighted him. The Prince of Wales accorded him special rights, and the authorities at Broadmoor gave him his own set of keys. A whole entertainment structure was built to house him and to make him feel secure. That's no one's fault. Entertainment, like literature, thrives on weirdos, and Savile entered a culture made not only to tolerate his oddness, but to find it refreshing. We can't say so. We can't know how to admit it, because we don't know who we are. This is the worst crisis that I can remember in my nearly 50 years at the BBC, John Simpson said on Panorama. It's off the scale of everybody's belief system, said the DJ Paul Gambaccini. But it is our belief system. And it's part of the same system to blame Savile. He's dead anyway. Let's blame him for all the things he obviously was, and blame him for a host of other things we don't understand, such as how we love freaks and how we select and protect people who are eccentric in order to feed our need for disorder. Now, I can't say I knew very much about Jimmy Savile growing up, because he was never a star in North America, and he never made any attempt to cross over to the American market. He was quite happy to be the most famous man in the British Isles. But occasionally one would see pictures of footage of him with the Beatles or the Rolling Stones, or a clip of him introducing someone on Top of the Pops, say. And my shock was that this man is obviously deranged, and he appears to be evil. The evil leer on his face, the evil deranged leer. Why is he on the stage? How could someone this distressing looking become a star, become the best respected man in Britain? And I guess it is the cult of the weirdo. That no, we don't want normal people. We're sick of normal people. Normal people are boring. Normal people are horrible. We want weirdos. Now, it's, O'Hagan, is true that the entertainment industry has always, gravitated towards weirdos, but, in many cases, this was largely an act. Apparently in the 1970s, Alice Cooper terrified moms and dads. But it was well known that Alice Cooper was a regular guy who liked to drink beer and play golf. He did not go around 24/7 appearing to be a ghoul or a monster, as Jimmy Savile did. Davis's book is called In Plain Sight, because if you look at the Jimmy Savile tale from the beginning, he came just to the edge of admitting that he was a rabid pedophile, over and over again. His love for virgins and his love for little, over and over again, that he hated children. It seems that Jimmy Savile pretty much hated the whole world, and Jimmy Savile's story, it's a success story. It's a story of someone who should have been forgotten, becoming a somebody. Jimmy Savile was born in Leeds, in West Yorkshire, in 1926, and he died in Leeds at the age of 84 in 2011. A lad from Leeds, lust for life. That's a line from The Thick of It, actually. But I guess it could describe Jimmy Savile. That's the way that he portrayed himself in the media, when he was not actually telling terrifying stories of, hiring Sonderkommandos, actual ones, as bouncers, and delighting in people, being beaten savagely and the like. and putting the frighteners on business rivals. Jimmy Savile was, I suppose, he pretty much invented DJing as we know it. And he certainly was the first celebrity DJ, a man who actually became as popular as the bands, or more popular than most bands. This is a deplorable trend, and he invented it. The two turntables, a proper large sound system, and again, the idea that I'm the star. The music isn't the star. I am the star, which we see in DJ culture to this day. Jimmy Savile had powerful friends, and he worked assiduously at making powerful friends. And I'm going to read a section from Davis's book. Jimmy Savile is attempting to impress Davis, which he never stopped doing. I've accomplished so much. So many powerful people can't do without me. All the awards I've given, etc., etc., etc. Below the cabinets were 2 shelves crammed with boxes. He told me they contained his papal knighthood, the Queen's knighthood, and his knighthood of Malta. Next to them was a Doctor of Law certificate and a picture of Savile with his mother and another man outside Buckingham Palace. That's where I got my OBE, he said. That's Joe, one of the porters I worked for years at Leeds General Infirmary. From the table, he picked the older of his 2 This Is Your Life books. The cover was brown rather than red. Disappointingly, it was a shoddily put together album of out-of-focus pictures. In those days, there were no videos or anything like that, so the back page is an LP of the soundtrack of the show, Savile explained. That's my brother Vince, and that's John. That's the girl who used to do my hair. That's Davy Jones out of Monkeys. That's my sister Mary from Australia. In that second one, there's a great letter at the back, Savile pointed out. He settled back into his chair and waited for me to read it aloud. Quote, the last time Jimmy was seen going through the gate Downing Street, he was dressed for the occasion. He was dressed in running shoes and puffing away on a cigar. He has quite the most distinctive approach to fitness training. Some might even say it was a little eccentric, but then so many Great Britons have had a touch of eccentricity about them. And Jimmy is truly a Great Britain. He is a stunning example of opportunity Britain, a dynamic example of enterprise Britain, and an inspiring example of responsible Britain at Leeds General Infirmary, Stoke Mandeville, and Broadmoor, to name only 3 institutions which have benefited from his charity compassion. Miner, wrestler, dancehall manager, disc jockey, hospital porter, fundraiser, performer of the works, officer of the most excellent empire, knight of the realm, Jimmy, I and millions more salute you. God bless you, unquote. It was signed, Margaret Thatcher. Now, as previously mentioned, rumors of his depravity, and the rumors of his depravity included suspicions that he was a murderer, also that he was a necrophiliac. They had dogged him for decades. He was asked about this by reporters constantly. Not about the murdering or necrophilia, because in those days, even the tabloids had their limits. But Margaret Thatcher fell in love with Jimmy Savile. Now, this is a man, that I would cross the street to avoid, but they had something in common, as Davis points out. They were both outsiders who had made good. And Margaret Thatcher and her husband, Dennis, would have Jimmy Savile for Christmas, over for Christmas lunch at her country house, Chequers. She tried to get a knighthood for Jimmy Savile for year after year after year, and the civil service said, no, 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 no. This will bring the honors system into disrepute. And finally, she wore them down and bullied them sufficiently that he became Sir Jimmy Savile, whereupon he started telling everyone that he was well and truly off the hook now. That, of course, to destroy Jimmy Savile would truly put the system the honor system in disrepute. And so he felt that he couldn't be touched, and it turns out that he was right. He was a not again child, or that's the story that he grew up in a well-off family, any means, but it would seem that he consistently exaggerated the degree of poverty in his youth. He was the last child of 7. His father was a bookmaker clerk. He was pretty much a small-time criminal. And I guess, streak of criminality running in the family. I mean, his father, Vincent, was basically, a gopher for a well-known in Leeds. But you see these people with chips on their shoulder, that I wasn't supposed to amount to anything, and I'll show them, and I have shown them. These are people of whom we should be greatly suspicious. But instead, they're typically, hailed, as go-getters, entrepreneurs, and the like. Jimmy Savile had a strange, overwhelming devotion to his mother, Agnes, who he referred to Duchess. And it says on her tombstone, the Duchess. That Jimmy Savile claimed that he could never be married, well, for all sorts of reasons. One, he consistently referred to, how would you say, emotional attachments to women as brain damage. That's the phrase he used over and over again. But that it would be unfair to his mother to abandon her. Well, most men get married and, understand. But, that's the way of nature. It was natural about Jimmy Savile. He spent 5 days after his mother, the Duchess, died, sitting in a chair next to her open coffin, and he described them frequently as the happiest days of his life. He spent a great deal of time with corpses. He delighted in being with dead people, talking about the tremendous sense of peace that they had, and how he envied them, to rumors of necrophilia about him. I was a puny kid growing up in Leeds, charged in the crucible of want. Yeah, poor mouthing, call it. He supposedly had a miracle cure when he was quite young. To what extent this has, been exaggerated is unknown, because Savile exaggerated everything that he did in his life. It would be impossible for Jimmy Savile to make any statement that did not have something of a lie in it. Davis points out that Savile never had some foil or mistake. All of his stories were in aid of glorifying Jimmy Savile, who of course was Britain's most admired man. I want to go back to this question of why someone like Jimmy Savile would have risen to the top in Britain. Well, let's see. Here's another selection from the book. When the Prime Minister still struggled to get Jimmy Savile's name on the shortlist submitted by the Honours Committee for the Queen's approval, there was little doubt that once she succeeded, it would be accepted without a second thought. His relationship to royals, and particularly Prince Charles and Princess Diana, became deeper and more intimate during the time he was seconded by the government to fix the mess at Broadmoor, which was a lunatic asylum. In 1987, Jimmy Savile had persuaded Charles to attend a ceremony for carers in London. A year later, he sat in the Prince of Wales' private office making calls to television producers, inviting them to a cocktail evening hosted by the Prince at Kensington Palace as a thanks for their contribution to a recent charity telethon. In November that year, Jimmy Savile was a guest at Charles's 40th birthday party. He played the fool to our big-eared Prince's Lear, recounted one St. James's Palace aide in the days before the funeral in Leeds. He could speak the truth, power with impunity, his own version of the truth, of course. But from all I could see, it was usually pretty good sense. And because he wasn't guilty of having a posh accent, an Oxbridge degree, or a suit, his words were received as from the itself, unquote. Starting after the Second World War, and particularly from the 1950s onward, it was best to be working class, or to claim to be working class. That the upper classes were, fagged out. They were worthless. They were responsible for Britain's decline. That the class system had to be abolished. And these young working class youths, this was the new Britain. It was absolutely relentless, to the extent that, pop stars would go to great lengths to disguise their middle class or upper class origins. I mentioned before that 4 of the 5 members of Genesis were from a leading English public school, and this later was considered shameful. Of course, this all turned around in Britain now, because all the pop stars do seem to come from public schools. But no, this cult of the proletarian, that they're realer than the rest of Britons, that they're more honest, they're grittier, sons of the soil, etc., etc. That's one of the reasons why Jimmy Savile thrived. It's one of the reasons why, yes. And I suppose another reason was that he was a psychopath. No question about it. That for decades, various interviewers, including Dr. Anthony Clare, a psychiatrist, and Louis Theroux, they attempted to, get to the bottom of the question, who is Jimmy Savile? And Jimmy Savile would make his jokes, the jokes that he had made on hundreds of other occasions, and tell his big stories and make wild statements. Oh, you see, since this fellow talks about his liking for young girls so often, he couldn't possibly be a pedophile. Davis writes, if Jimmy Savile had learned anything at Broadmoor, he might have grasped the black irony underscoring this statement. That is to say, we don't have any psychopaths at Broadmoor. For delivering it was a man who exhibited so many of the behavioral traits on the psychopathy checklist Robert Hare devised to identify those who committed crimes. The slippery charm, the mask worn to conceal his true self from others, the low cunning and willingness to manipulate, the absence of normal human emotions, the lack of empathy, the sexual promiscuity, the inability to admit mistakes, the fear of commitment, the ability to evade capture, and most importantly, the repeated attacks on the vulnerable. Of course, Jimmy Savile would not have been able to see this due to the grandiose self-image that made him incapable of understanding how others might perceive him. Savile went on to defend those who had committed awful crimes while racked with mental illness, arguing there's no point asking about that dark night when something terrible happened because it wasn't really them doing it. It was someone else using their body. It was the same rationale he used for his own sexual desire in God Will Fix It. Savile was much liked by that fool Basil Hume, the Archbishop of Westminster. He received a papal knighthood, granted an audience by the Pope, and the things that he says about his behavior and his religious beliefs in this book, God Will Fix It, are absolutely shocking. As Davis says, it was all there in plain sight. Savile appeared on religious programs, co-hosts of religious programs, just incredible stuff. And an Anglican priest who had been one of his partners on this show had to listen to Jimmy Savile speak at great length, and he described, his heresy as supererogation. That is to say, that Jimmy Savile believed that getting into heaven was a question of a ledger. Okay, so bad things up to here. But if good things were higher than the bad things, that means that St. Peter would have to let him in. And he talked about St. Peter having to let him in over and over again. Jimmy Savile was a Bevan boy, or so he claims. The Bevan boys were young men who were conscripted not into the armed forces, but into the mines. Yes, pretty grim work. Now, Savile seemed to be on intimate terms with, all of the knowledge about mines. He seemed to have personal knowledge about mines. The man who led the association that worked for official recognition for the Bevan boys, which didn't come until decades later, was convinced that Jimmy Savile had never been a Bevan boy, that he had impersonated someone else to get out of this. It could be that the organizer was quite miffed that Jimmy Savile would have nothing to do with his organization, presumably because he wouldn't be allowed to be the star. And Savile again claims a miraculous recovery from a terrible accident that he suffered. And it seems likely that he greatly exaggerated how bad the accident was and how long he was incapacitated for. The various stories that he told about being a Bevan boy, that this went on for 8 years or something, they're obviously untrue because Savile had been making his way in the business world. He began as a cyclist, a competitive cyclist, and he was actually quite good at it, but he preferred to clown around instead. And later he was a professional wrestler. And but then he got into the dance hall business, and dance halls were hugely popular in Britain in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And he learned from the bottom up about how the dance hall business began, and you could say that he actually revolutionized it, that he made it modern. First to introduce rock and roll dancing to the dance halls, which completely had previously abhorred that sort of thing. That Savile became, the friend of the teeny boppers. Now, keep in mind that by, say, Rock Around the Clock came out, in 1956? Jimmy Savile was already 30 years old when that happened. But of course, because he went around with his, with his platinum bleached hair, with these odd colored glasses, typically wearing a shell suit, a track suit, things like pink slippers and the like, he seemed more youthful than he actually was. Now, many people thought that he was homosexual because of his attire and way of carrying on. And when you look at this type, Jimmy Savile's type, Savile was a rapist. It seems likely that he raped hundreds of people in his life, boys as well as girls, and as young as 9 years old. What you see amongst homosexuals, what you also see very often, extremely often in rapists and serial killers, is the same thing. A strong, dominating mother and a weak or absent father. And that's what you see with Jimmy Savile's and the family, no question about it. That it was the mother that all the children looked up to, not the father. And we know that one of his elder brothers, Vince, was a sexual abuser as well. So Jimmy Savile was poised. He was in the right place when the Beatles came along, the Beatles and Rolling Stone, the English Invasion. He knew all of these people. He'd been a DJ, and so, you want to get your records played. And he had this uncanny ability to insinuate himself with people. There's famous photographs of him with the Beatles, all pretending to be asleep, him with the Rolling Stones, him with everybody. He was a disc jockey at Radio Luxembourg. He was a presenter on Top of the Pops, and everyone wanted to get close to Jimmy Savile. Savile was famous for his charity work. But it is, and it's true that he raised tens of billions of pounds for charity. But one has to look at this distastefully, because he was always telling the whole world of his charitable endeavors, just never stopped. I'm going to be speaking in a week or two about Franz Liszt. Franz Liszt made a fortune, a large fortune for charity, and he gave away almost all of his money, and he made a fortune. But Liszt didn't talk about this. And of course, in those times, the fact that someone gives several, charity concert for films in Hungary, well, the rest of Europe isn't going to know about this, but just considered shameful and sinful, in fact, from a religious point of view, to boast of one's own charitable endeavors. But Savile could not stop. And these charitable endeavors all enriched him, because he got all manner of payoffs from people and from companies. He was a mean man, and I mean mean in the English sense, that he did not like spending money. He lived for years and years and years in very Spartan conditions, even in squalor, when he could afford to live decently. And he was not the kind of person to pay for another person's drink or another person's meal, even for women. No, because what would be the point of that? The only time he ever opened his wallet was to do something which was going to make him richer and more famous. Now, I mentioned how Jimmy Savile looked, and at the time that he started at the CBC, at the BBC, there were a number of horrified comments from viewers that it seemed that a line had been crossed there, but he was seen as gold from the beginning. That he was a man that was impossible to ignore. That you love him or hate him, you can't keep your eyes off him. Davis includes this in his book. The BBC did research into how his appearances on Top of the Pops were being received. This is from January 1964. The greatest number of objections was aimed at Jimmy Savile, mainly because of his appearance. What an odd-looking individual, said a solicitor, and others expanded this to call him a cross between a beetle and an Aldwych farce curate, like a Presbyterian minister, like something from Doctor Who. Really horrific. It ought to have an X certificate. And there was Mr. Savile presiding over the orgy like a Puritan clergyman resurrected from his own churchyard. This is from a retired naval officer. Again from January. It is clear, too, that many found Jimmy Savile's manner and appearance in introducing the program disconcerting to a degree. Is this Jimmy Savile sane? I must say his most peculiar appearance and manner suggest otherwise. I couldn't understand a word of his gabble either, a real nit, a proper twerp, a big idiotic nothing. And from December 1964, Jimmy Savile, who introduced the program on this occasion, was obviously disliked by a large number of the sample audience. Many indicated their aversion to the artist by remarking that anything they had to say about him would be quite unprintable, whilst comment by those who freely expressed their feelings was liberally larded with such terms as this nutcase, this obnoxious thing, this revolting spectacle. True, a small number admired and liked him. Of course, he is utterly zany, but he puts life and laughter into the program, and he is clearly with it as regards pop music. But even some of those considered his hairstyle a bit too much. As a disc jockey, he is great, but I think he ought to get his hair cut because it looks ridiculous. Many more, however, clearly found him an abomination in every respect. There's kind of a community of disc jockeys in Britain. Jimmy Savile was never part of it. There was no camaraderie there. He just saw everyone in the DJ business who was not him as a threat to him. He didn't seem to have any friends. He had acquaintances. He had people who could do things for him. And women, I suppose, who could do things for him. But he groped them, or, he raped them. And then they were sent off on their way. And when they complained at the various hospitals where he had insinuated himself, they were ignored. And these girls and boys were accused of being fantasists, or of a malicious desire to take down a great Englishman. Now, it's true enough that I learned this when I was a reporter, that there are vile rumors spread about every man prominent in public life. But when one hears the same thing again and again, in place after place, from all sorts of different people, one is forced to conclude that this is likely true. There were various reports made to the police, but Jimmy Savile, he cultivated the police. They became part of his people. Apparently, he liked to smoke dope with them, with Yorkshire police in the 1960s. The Surrey police, Yorkshire police, Metropolitan London police. There are complaints against him over decades from many, many, many sources, and they were all ignored. And in fact, over 100 pages or over 100 documents relating to Jimmy Savile were reported some years ago of having vanished from official files. I suppose there would be powerful people implicated, But Prince Charles adored him, and he was quite close with the Princess of Wales. Prince Philip, very fond of him. Margaret Thatcher thought he was of Britain's ruling class. Of course, as Andrew O'Hagan pointed out, the British light entertainment system was designed to create monsters, famous pedophiles, predatory homosexuals on BBC staff from the past, going back to the 1940s. And they worked with children. And they said that they hated children, just like Jimmy Savile. Now, he wrote in his biography when he was talking about some of the masters too little and some of them too much. And one has to wonder about an adult who spends so much time with children who are not his own children. It's unnatural. Men typically find other people's children, when they're small, to be annoying. That they, perhaps these children will do the same sort of thing that your own children, but your own children, you often find it adorable and not annoying. Again, Jimmy Savile surrounding himself with dandling a 13-year-old girl on his knees, joking on top of the pops about getting two of these age girls, and Gary Glitter getting two. Yes, that actually. And to give you an idea of his popularity, he made a host of programs for them. Jim Savile to get people to use seatbelts. Now, they made a whole show about that. Obviously, there was more to it than that, but it was called Click, and then Jim will fix it. On one Christmas special in the 1980s, 20 million people watched it. That's more than 1 out of every Britons at the time. An idea of how popular he was. But there's repeated suggestions there was this sort of depravity. The BBC, the young underage girls were swapped for amongst DJs, presenters, cameramen, aware of all this, and they just swept it under the rug for decades. His book begins with an account of how the BBC had else. But the BBC was planning to run a special episode of Jim will fix it after Jimmy had died and was subject to the plot. And BBC decided that it would be too embarrassing to have to hold a tribute show to Savile, so they killed the story. hundreds or thousands of hours had been put into this, and it would. But the BBC, nope, not going to do it. And they consistently lied about why they had shut down. That they put a story that, oh, we can confirm that the Crown Prosecution Service had decided not to prosecute Jimmy Savile because of his age and ill health. The show, the expose, to include that criminal BBC property. One would thought that would be enough. All would be enough. There wasn't. The great he so the tremendous show a few years ago called the story of panel show, the British love the panel show, and it's a parody of Call My Bible. Certain word. One of the words is people, and so you have the people with the speech impediments speaking, saying, and at the end the host says, well, that was a trick question because there's no such thing as a pedophile. And that was the attitude of the BBC for decades. Now, I guess a similar thing has happened with the BBC, has happened with the Catholic Church. That because this culture of depravity was allowed to flourish for so many decades, that it simply became routine for everyone to be accused of depravity, even people who had nothing to do with it. And if the depravity had been dealt with when it should have been, what happened later, many false accusations would not have happened. But the Catholic Church and the BBC can only blame themselves for what happened afterwards, which is Operation U-Tree, which is that it seems that every single person who worked for the BBC, in a broadcasting capacity, was accused of offenses against women or offenses against underage women. A real witch hunt. I look at the conviction of Rolf Harris, the Australian entertainer, and I don't see how it is possible for a man to defend himself against a he said, she said situation about something that happened more than 40 years ago. Jimmy Savile, all of the sins, he's the sin eater. That one expects that Jimmy Savile is going to be blamed for the murder of the Lindbergh baby. He's going to be blamed for the murder of the princes in the tower. Because since it is difficult to prove what exactly he did, essentially he's being accused of everything, which is very convenient for the establishment. Because, it was just this one monster. Whereas, as O'Hagan points out, there's been a culture of pedophilic depravity at the BBC going back to the 1940s or perhaps even earlier. The name Harriet Harman appears in the book, and it's nice to be reminded of this shocking story. Harriet Harman, a very prominent Labour Party politician, cabinet minister, still very prominent in the Labour Party. I'll read this. Despite public fears about children being at risk from predatory adults and a shift in emphasis in childcare away from solving and containing the problem of delinquency and towards the protection of the most vulnerable members of society, in April 1978, the National Council for Civil Liberties stated that two of its affiliated groups, the Pedophile Information Exchange and Pedophile Action for Liberation, should be allowed to campaign for an abolition of the age of consent. Jim Callaghan's Labour government was planning to reform the law at the time, and the Protection of Children Bill proposed to tighten the rules on child pornography by outlawing indecent images of children under the age of 16. The NCCL's response was to advocate reducing the age of consent to 14, arguing that childhood sexual experiences willingly engaged in with an adult result in no identifiable damage. It claimed children would suffer more from having to recount their experiences in court. In 1976, the NCCL had filed a submission to a parliamentary committee, arguing that the next law could lead to damaging and absurd prosecutions. 2 years later, a letter written by the NCCL's legal officer, a young lawyer named Harriet Harman, in official response to the bill, argued that pornographic photos or films of children should not be classified as indecent unless it could be proven that the child had suffered. The NCCL's suggested amendment placed the onus of proof on the prosecution. In its official submission, the NCCL stated, although this harm may be of a somewhat speculative nature, where participation falls short of physical assault, it is nonetheless justifiable to restrain activities by photographers which involve placing children under the age of 14, or arguably 16, in sexual situations. We suggest that the term indecent be qualified as follows. A photograph or film should not for this purpose be considered indecent, A, by reason only that the model is in a state of undress, whether complete or partial, B, unless it is proved or it is to be inferred from the photograph or film that the making of the photograph or film might reasonably be expected to have caused the model physical harm or pronounced psychological or emotional disorder. The Private Eye magazine exposed in the 1970s that the pedophile information exchange was not simply about arguing for civil liberties for child molesters. They were active in trading thousands of pictures of child molestation, including as young as babies. And it was an active network of predatory pedophiles who seemed to have considerable influence in Britain's diplomatic service. And the NCCL, the National Council for Civil Liberties, had considerable influence within the Labour Party. Now, why is it that Harriet Harman's career was not destroyed when her advocacy for child molestation was revealed? One has to come to the conclusion that there are powerful forces in British society who work to protect pedophiles. Dan Davis's book, it's remarkable. It's exceedingly disturbing, I have to say, to read. The assaults themselves and the determination of the authorities to ignore them and to ruin the lives of the girls and boys, often men and women at the time, who made the accusations. But it's really an astonishing story. Truth, once again, is stranger than fiction. I mean, just starting with Jimmy Savile himself, who he was, how he talked, how he dressed, how he carried on, becoming the most admired man in Britain, being given effective control of Broadmoor. Yes. Being given privileges in and out, do what you like, at least 3 other medical institutions. Leeds General and Care Home for Girls, and that he was in and out of a care home on the accused of monstrous. It seems he was there regularly for 5 years. He had keys to all the rooms at Broadmoor. Can you imagine that? Imagine that humanity in recent British life. Those are my thoughts on Dan Davis's excellent In Plain Sight. Let's have a final look at the chat. MCT says Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart describing the difficulty of defining porn. I'll know it when I see it. An art form. Oh, thank you. God bless all. Restful weekend. Indeed. Chad Chadson says they're killing Catholicism. Well, essentially, they have killed it off. I mean, it's still around, but it's totally disgraced. Pope John Paul II knew about this in great detail. From 1979? He had a detailed report from a Vatican emissary in Washington, D.C. And the report was hushed up. It disappeared, and the Vatican emissary was dismissed from his post. The Pope knew all about it, but the Pope simply didn't want to do anything about it. He was not an administrator. He had no time for that. Why he allowed himself to be elected Pope when he clearly had no interest in administration is an interesting question. He was a silly, vain man who lived to globetrot and to be shouted at, and acclaimed by hundreds of thousands at a time. He traveled while Rome burned. Anyone here British, says Vox Days. Well, I'm half British. Yeah, in the 1960s, everything British became popular in America. That having a British accent made you a magnet to women. And, it didn't have to be a, Liverpudlian accent. It could be any kind of accent, even a Cockney spib, people talk like this. But apparently that made you irresistible to women. Glib Medley says The Fall did 24 Peel sessions from 1978 to 2004. Yeah, I'm thinking that the leader of The Fall, the singer, songwriter, what's his name? Marky Smith. I guess you could call him a British or English eccentric, Mark Patty Mancunian Patty Smith without the good looks. Who are we talking about? Oh, John Cooper Clarke. Yeah, there's I guess the big Joy Division documentary, and Joy Division is playing on Grenada TV, and I think they're doing transmission, and it's tremendous performance. And just as it's winding up, they cut to John Cooper Clarke and his terrible, terrible poetry. No. We want to hear the end of the song. In the same way, I guess it's part of the same series, a documentary on New Order that I watched. Again, they start with Joy Division playing live on Grenada TV, and about songs about to end, there's that Pratt Bono. No, shut up. Go back to the music. Nobody wants to hear you, you tiny little prat. Justin Proto says, seems like it's a long-standing policy of English police departments to not only ignore but enable the rape of children. Well, we could talk about, Rothermere is not far from Leeds, and in Yorkshire, and in the Midlands, and in Newcastle, in Oxford, well, for 20 years or so, we had, as they're called, Asian men grooming and raping thousands of girls, as young as 12, 13, and everybody knew about it. But it was decided that it would be terribly racist to do anything about it. So it was ignored. And in fact, it was officially approved by the authorities from the highest level nationally to the local police and councils, because you don't want to annoy the Muslims now, do you? Glib Medley says Marky Smith's autobiography is good stuff. Well, I will have to I'll have to check it out. That's the show for today and this week. And what do we have coming up? We have a very grim movie next Thursday. It's called Come and See, from Elam Klimov. It was made in 1985. It's about World War II, as experienced by a adolescent boy in White Russia. September the 10th, we have a quite brilliant and thrilling film from Robert Hamer, 1947. It's an Ealing film, but it's not the kind of thing that one would normally associate with Ealing. It's called It Always Rains on Sunday. On September 17th, I'm going to be discussing 6 cartoons by Tex Avery, one of the great American geniuses of the 20th century. And on September 24th, I will be discussing Ozu's Good Morning. On the book club next week, The Once and Future King by T.H. White, which is a modern version of the Arthur myth. On September 11th, Alan Walker's Magisterial Franz Liszt. On September 18th, Willa Cather's Death Comes for the Archbishop. And on September 25th, Christopher Lash's The Culture of Narcissism. If you like the show or anything about it, I'd appreciate it if you'd click on the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not done so already. If you would like to contribute to this live stream, you can do so through PayPal. And the address is kevin_grace@hotmail.com. Again, kevin_grace@hotmail.com. If you're Canadian, you can contribute directly through Interact at kevingrace@shaw.ca. And I'll leave you with this. In these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly hope that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to form a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.